And there we go. We're live on both YouTube and Rumble. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the race set before us. Today we are going to discuss NHL hockey player Ivan Provorov refusing to wear a rainbow jersey for Pride Night, citing his Christian faith. We'll go through the details of the backlash that Ivan received, as well as answer the question this situation raises, which is, why aren't more Christian men as vocal and courageous in the public eye? We'll also discuss Tennessee's new legislation that seeks to censor news outlets and companies in Tennessee. And finally, we'll break down Tennessee's new House bill that supports efforts to ban drag shows for minors across the state. It's Monday Night Live, so drop your questions in the chat and we will answer them throughout the stream. Get a drink and get comfy because we have a lot to go through. So joining us for a second appearance is Will Spencer from Renaissance of Men. So Will, introduce yourself.
Well, first, thanks so much for having me back on the podcast and for inviting me to participate in this roundtable discussion. So my name is Will Spencer. I host the Renaissance of Men podcast, which is a podcast about the rebirth of virtuous masculinity happening around the world. And of course, that has a lot to do with Christianity, as many men are discovering, and as many Christians have known for a while, and more Christians are themselves discovering. And I also host a 12-week men's mentorship program, which you can learn more about at renofmen.com/mentorship. And I host men's groups online as well.
Excellent. And joining us for his first serious episode, heir apparent to Pete Buttigieg, Joey the Bootmaker. Joey, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Joey the Bootmaker, one of my many titles. I'm also a husband, father, and follower of Christ, and probably some other ones I'm missing, right?
We'll give you your own titles.
That's a
and
good
finally,
resume.
Regular favorite of the show, Michael Aper.
Hey, friends. I follow Jesus. I want to know the Bible well and be true to it in masculine righteousness.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and get into our first story. So this is from the Post-Millennial. Flyers defenseman Ivan Provorov refused to wear a rainbow jersey for the team's Pride Night warm-up against the Ducks on Tuesday. While justifying the move to reporters, the Russian-born enforcer cited his Christian faith. I respect everybody's choices, Provorov said following the game, which the Flyers won 5-2. My choice is to stay true to my religion. That's all I'm going to say. When reporters pressed him further, he replied, that's all I'm going to comment on that. If you have any hockey questions, I would answer those. So that's the quick context here. But gentlemen, what was your initial thoughts on this incident with Ivan and the Flyers?
Good for him.
Yeah,
good for him.
Absolutely. Well, Joey, you're an expert on all things gay and hockey, so can you please tell us a little bit about this?
I hope you guys are friends.
No.
Am I an expert in both of those fields? Just because I'm playing hockey after this podcast doesn't mean I'm an expert. But honestly, this is why I'm kind of fed up with the. This isn't a unique thing. It's just the first time I feel like someone's actually opposed it. And it's kind of why I'm not following it all. For years, I'm a Washington State resident and waited for years and years for an NHL team only to get one of the more woke teams in the league. And it's a bummer. But Philadelphia was actually my team growing up. And yeah, they don't have very many redeeming reasons to follow them now because they play pretty lousy. And Provorov might be their only saving grace right now. Yeah. Not that I necessarily agree with the Russian Orthodox Church in every aspect, but
yeah. Well, Michael, let's get your initial reaction.
I think it's just so refreshing to have an athlete who doesn't feel the need to virtue signal and chooses to stay in his lane. Even later into that article, they talk about how he's been asked by reporters about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. And he says, you don't need to know my opinion on that. I'm here to play hockey, and it doesn't really have to do with my opinion on politics. And I think that's just so nice in a world of the LeBron James that think that they need to tell us how to live our lives because they play sports. And I'm not saying that people can't use a platform to promote what is good, what is right. Certainly there's room for that. But for a guy who's just trying to live his life and play his game, I don't see why he has to make such a strong stance for why he doesn't want to put on a rainbow jersey if he chooses not to. Like, being forced to celebrate something is such a fascinating place that our culture's in. And having that pressure, there's been a lot of people who say that he should be basically canceled, that he should have been benched for the game, or that he should be suspended from the league because of his insubordination. And I just don't see what any of this has to do with hockey. Is it really the gay sport? I don't think so.
No.
It certainly hasn't been historically. I don't know.
I want to push. Can I push back on that a little bit?
Please, yeah. Absolutely.
Honestly, I mean, yes, it's refreshing to have somebody not talking politics, but I mean, frankly, we're at war. And if the way that you structure your series of identities, so for example, like I'm a Christian, then I'm a man, then I'm an American, then I'm a white person or something like that. If I had to pick my hierarchy identity tree, way down at the bottom there is like podcast host, right? Or whatever it is I do, right? Now, if like Christian is first, right? And so if all of American culture, world culture is really under attack by this ideology that says specifically Christianity is bad, then your hierarchy of identities should be like, yeah, no, I'm not just going to set this aside. I'm going to go to war in response, as opposed to saying like, well, I'm just a hockey player. It's like, well, no, you're a Christian first, right? And whether he needs to launch into like a 3-minute apologetic diatribe is another thing. But I think people are starving, especially men are starving for heroes. Like we don't have any. None. There's none in the public square that are standing up for anything. And so much so that when a hockey player says, no, I'm not going to wear the jersey, it's like, oh, finally somebody, right? But where are the heroes? Like it takes that guy. And so I think maybe men do need to make more forceful statements because we're dying for men to.
Yeah.
So allow me a rebuttal then.
No.
Because we live in a world of relative morality. And
no, we don't.
Unfortunately, well, us four do not, but
neither does anybody else.
They would like to think they do.
Well, yeah, but I mean, some people would like to think that gravity doesn't exist either.
True. Well, we all know the Earth is flat, so
yeah. As long as we have that established.
I'm a pyramid Earth guy myself, but
excellent. Yeah. No, but what I'm getting at is that every player on the field should have an identity hierarchy that has hockey player at best third or fourth on the list,
right.
And if every one of them felt a compulsion to use the time dedicated to their hockey playing to make a statement about their belief system outside of hockey, then it would just be a constant circus of virtue signaling in one direction or another. What I would say is that hats off to Ivan for saying, no, I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to talk about it either. Let me play the game. But also, to your point, Christ comes first before hockey and before all of the things. And that's why I say earlier, like, yeah, it's good to use a platform. So people are probably watching him now more than ever, and I think it would be a great opportunity for him to take a good stance about why he believes in traditional values and maybe build that out outside of the ice or outside of the rink. And maybe if he were able to fight that fight like you're talking about separate of the game, that I think would be more appropriate. It's when you get the moral debates that interact with the place that is consecrated for hockey or for basketball, whatever. Inevitably, if one person is going to stand up and give their opinion, then everyone should feel invited to do so. And at what point do we say, no, we're not here to listen to you talk about your stances on things. We're here to watch you play hockey.
Right, but I mean, they brought the fight to him.
Oh
right?
yeah,
Like,
no,
yeah,
I agree, and I think what he did was perfectly reasonable to say, no, I'm not going to wear it, and no, I'm not going to answer any questions. I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I'll stay true to my faith. That is a statement in itself that carries weight, especially when the whole world is looking at him and judging him based on his faith.
Mm-hmm.
That, I think, presents an opportunity for him to flesh out that faith and the argument for salvation, separate of the interviews where they're heckling him right outside of the tunnel when he's trying to leave the game or whatever.
Yeah. And one of the things that I wanted to have Will on for is you recently had a conversation, and this ties in really well with where we're already going. You had one with Nate Spearing, I believe, was the guest you had on, and you were talking about men standing up and how there's a lack of it, which we've already begun discussing here. But you were specifically talking about the fear that holds men back. So could you maybe unpack a little bit of what you were talking about with Nate, so that the other guys can kind of get some context and we can kind of dive into that?
Yeah, I mean, men have a pretty, all people really have a pretty, pretty standard set of fears. People they fear death, obviously. They fear authority. They fear pain. Which physical pain. They fear shame, which is the cool kids, right? The being shamed by the cool kids. Those are the things that men fear. Now, our human egos, also are interested in wealth, status, and security. Those are the things that our egos naturally look for from a psychological. You don't have to adapt some big, secular psychological framework to kind of see that. So what people will naturally fear is speaking up. Men in particular lately, Christians especially, is they're not necessarily afraid that they're physically going to die, but they're definitely afraid of authority. No, you can't do that. They're definitely be afraid of being shamed by the cool kids, right? Whoever they consider the cool kids to be. But mostly, I think men are afraid of losing their wealth. They're afraid of losing their status, and they're afraid of losing their security. And I think the way that I framed it on the intro was that there's danger and then there's trouble. Danger is a tiger has just leaped out of the bushes at you, right? Like, that's danger. Trouble is when someone says you're in trouble, and people are afraid of being in trouble, because if you're in trouble socially, which is a social thing, then you're in danger. And people fear trouble. I don't want to cause trouble. Trouble put me in danger. I can just as easily hide under a rock and I don't have to say anything. Oh yeah, my kid just came home with this pamphlet about, like, girls have penises too. Oh well. But that's the thing, is that men are afraid of getting in trouble, because they're afraid the trouble will put them in danger and they'll lose their wealth or status or security. And that's called someone's got you by the balls at that point.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of turn it over to the other guys. Do you guys kind of agree with Will's assessment? Joey, you can kind of give your answer first if you want.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking in general over the last 2 years of all the things we were mandated to do while at work. I had to sit in a room made out of shower curtains and wear a mask on my face while I'm sewing at a sewing machine, not near anybody.
Sounds kinky.
But I think of how stupid something like that I was worried about not wearing the mask and the potential of losing my job. But that's so minute compared to other things that I may face in my life, as far as true persecution goes.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I've got Bonhoeffer sitting behind me to remind me that I really don't have anything to complain about. But Michael, let's get your reaction.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I think the added levels, as a single man, I was less fearful, because if I lost my job, I'd go get another job and I can work for that. And if it comes to it and I don't have somewhere to sleep or don't have a meal, I can deal with that easier than my family can. Now, having a spouse has added a level, I think for myself, I've noticed in my heart, a level of fear of danger, because it's not just me who's in danger, it's those that I'm responsible for as well.
Mhm.
And the risks that I may take in a social format that could jeopardize my wealth or my status or my viability in our culture, that's a much more pressing fear now than it ever has been. Because if I can't provide for my family, then what? You know, that's it's easier to not provide for myself. But if I leave my wife wanting, that's a tougher pill to swallow, and it adds a different layer. And I think that rings true. And it's a much more difficult challenge than to say, okay, how do I prioritize? Like Will said at the very beginning, is Christ my center, and is Christ at my commitment to Christianity and my devotion to faith, is that a priority, or is having the nice house a priority, or having whatever savings, or all the commodities that I'd like to surround our family with? That's a tough battle.
Yeah. Yeah. And really quick, I would just want to say that Zach Avala is in the chat, and he says, I too have a room made of shower curtains. It's got activities. So just thought I'd give you guys that lovely input
Sewing, I'm sure. Yeah.
from
I
Zach.
should-
But
Let me pull up the YouTube channel because I'd like to see who's in the chat too.
yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to kind of go off of that though, Michael, because I completely agree with you, and I think it only just accelerates once you start having children. That
I can
feeling,
only
because
imagine.
you
Yeah.
just have more people that you're responsible for. But you know, in addition to that, you kind of think like you and your wife, like, you know, worst case scenario, if you know I lose my job, we can both, you know, even if I lose my well-paying job, we can both get, you know, mediocre jobs and make the same amount. Well, then you have kids, and you're like, well, no, we can't both do that because someone has to watch the kids. So then it's, you know, even more so. It's like the safety net gets smaller, and so, you know, just balancing that fear. So I don't know. So Will, do you feel like there's an obvious solution besides just, of course, saying, you know, have faith? Because obviously we're all believers here, and I believe that we all do know that naturally. But what would you say to the man that has those fears about speaking out, like Ivan did to the hockey league about the pride jersey?
Right. Well, I think the first step is to recognize that we didn't get to this position by accident, right? Like it didn't just like spring up out of the ground. There's been decades of very careful cultivation to put Americans, men, and Christians in a position where, in a sense, they're owned. And so men and women get owned in in different ways. One of them is through debt. That if you have debt built up for your house or college or whatever, you know, if you lose your job, you lose your debt, and then all sorts of bad things happen from the bank. So the cultivation of the maybe I'll call it a cult of debt. I don't know that it's culto, but the cultivation of debt as a way of doing business in America began, you know, in the 80s, if sooner. So there's that. But then there's also the notion of churches, men being reliant on the corporate state, right? Men working for large corporations instead of small businesses. And there's been an ongoing persecution of small business owners via the IRS for the past several decades, and the growth of the big brand that goes back to the pre-World War I era, the cultivation of the brand over the small business. So that's 100 years of that. And then when you look at the church, and what kind of values is the church preaching to men? Is it preaching sovereignty? Is it preaching headship of the home? Is it preaching independence from state-sponsored schools? Is it preaching a message of sin repentance? Absolutely not. And so these are the ways that men have been led by the nose into a situation where the trap in 2020 of COVID could spring on everybody. And so now everyone's in this position where they're chained down, pinned up, you know, with a noose around their neck, being like, yeah, try and speak up now. And so I think there needs to be a reckoning for the pastors of America, for the fathers of America, for the politicians of America, essentially generations of men that have put men like us in that position where we have to choose between truth and feeding our kids. This was not the way it was supposed to be. And so once that reckoning is complete, then we can begin assessing what do we do about it. But the blame has to be shared because we didn't create this. We were handed this situation.
Yeah, I agree with that. The borrower is slave to the lender.
Yes.
And I mean, there's so much to be said because there's obviously personal choices. Like you can choose to go to school for a degree that is going to lead to no results, where you're going to, graduate with 60,000 or more in debt, and that's on you. But at the same time, like, the culture that we see ourselves in, so many of the bricks were laid before any of us were even born. Even just like the way our monetary theory works out. And you're right. It's like, it's just a primer for control. And we are in that place. And it's going to take a lot to kind of throw off those shackles. So, I mean, do any of you guys have any thoughts on, how we can better reclaim some of that freedom so that there's less of that control when it comes to us, being bold in the public square?
I just say don't comply. I mean, and not just not comply by letting it roll off your back and not pay attention to it, act like it's not being there, but actively speaking out against it, because that's how incrementally this stuff happens. Is it starts out small and we don't really think about it because that's all it is, and then it just builds up a little bit more severe every increment, and we get to the point where we're losing our jobs, or we can't shop at the stores in town. You never know. I mean, for a while we thought my wife wouldn't have a job at the hospital. Talking about the mandates for the injection and whatnot, not necessarily the Pride Night stuff, but similar. So yeah, incrementally. It makes me look back and wish I had spoken out a little bit more early on.
Yeah,
there's a big reason why our culture has, specifically with Christian, I think, men, there's a big push towards homesteading and self-sufficiency. And I think it's a way that people realize that they can get out from under the thumb, where if I'm less reliant on what the populace is providing for me, then I don't have to play by their rules the same way. And I know that's something we've talked about on this podcast before, but it's an important thing to think about. To what end? Should we go completely off the grid and just not conform to any social media? Or, what does that look like? Because I don't think that it is correct for us to go completely off the grid and be entirely self-sufficient mountain men and never see any other human, because there is a great commission that we are called to follow through as well. And how can we witness to others in the decisions that we make to pursue autonomy away from the governance, but also abide in a people that are desperate for Jesus?
Yeah. I mean, I think to solve that problem, I think it's important that every man start some sort of content creation, right? Like I'm in a group of Reformed Baptist men, and literally all of them have podcasts, and it's almost like, do you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, splash, here's your podcast. Right? It's kind of, and I think on the street evangelism, I go to Apologia in Phoenix, and they're big on the street evangelism several times a week. And so that's a big part of it as well. But that, I don't know that, discipling the nations, Great Commission, I don't know that means that we have to live downtown in an urban area and be subject to whatever 15-minute cities. Like I think we can be physically, and I guess in terms of provisionally outside of the system and still carry that out.
Yeah. It's that tricky balance of, because I think what you were trying to get at, Michael, is like we can't hide from the world, but at the same time we have to reclaim some of that sovereignty. So it's striking that balance of not trying to become an island, because that's a recipe for disaster, but then at the same time, of course, making sure that you also aren't so codependent upon systems that, the moment those systems, ask you to bow before their idols, or else you get thrown into the fiery furnace, maybe you can, um, have some ability to speak out before the only option is the fiery furnace. But
No.
I don't know. So I don't know. I mean, I know that for myself, I've been learning more homesteading stuff. I know Joey has as well. So Joey, do you feel like kind of some of that homesteading knowledge that you've been doing, has that helped you to feel a little bit more in control, not necessarily an unhealthy way of trying to be a control freak, but maybe just a little bit more capable?
More capable, yes, but I would say even more so for me, it's been taking control of my health and knowing what I'm putting into my body. Because the government doesn't necessarily have your best interest in mind with the regulations.
What? You sound like a conspiracy theorist.
Total nut job. Who invited this guy?
Yeah. So I smile every time I drink my raw milk, knowing that the government doesn't want me to drink my raw milk.
Yeah. Praise God.
That's awesome. Well, Will, you work with a lot of men outside of your podcast as well. So have you noticed a trend, even in like you're in the greater Phoenix area, I believe. Have you noticed a trend with like homesteading, even in that kind of urban area?
Yeah, there's a big discussion between people. Chickens, for example, is a really good way to kind of get into that. And I think homesteading is also in some ways kind of a low resolution discussion, because it was a very brief period in American history where people were actually self-sufficient on their own homesteads. In fact, people actually lived in communities, because no one man or family can produce everything that they need, to survive. So different men develop different specializations. So, for example, you can't be your own farmer and your own gardener and your own blacksmith. You can't raise a barn on your own. all those things. And so the idea of the self-sovereign, totally independent man and family on his own in the frontier is not, it's not actually possible in the way that people imagine it. It's way more work, because the farm doesn't take a vacation, but also, men are meant to live in communities. So I think a better discussion is for men who are interested in technically, quote unquote, homesteading, is to begin forming and founding sovereign Christian communities, to begin breaking away from the urban corporate kind of city centers, and not to try and go it alone. Like, obviously having your own land, et cetera, is important, but finding church-centered Christian communities around the country and moving if necessary is important, and finding a specialty. In fact, I'm going to reach for a book real quick that I think everyone would like. It's called Durable Trades by Rory Groves. I don't know if you've heard of this book. This is a book that lists a large number of professions, quote unquote. It looks like I'm counting 62 professions that have stood the test of time. Like shepherd, farmer, midwife, gardener, woodworker, brewer, innkeeper, tutor, mason, silversmith, stuff like that. So these are all trades that men can learn that are durable, meaning that they will always be needed. So you find something in here that appeals to you in this book, and which is available on Amazon, and you can adopt that trade. And then when you find your way into a community of like-minded men, that is your trade. So, for example, my post-apocalyptic character class has always been priest or counselor, and that's in the book. I was very happy to discover. So different men will be called to different things, and you can put that trade to work in community.
That's awesome. I definitely want to check that book out, because I have not heard of that one, surprisingly, but it definitely kind of runs in a lot of the circles of a lot of the reading that I've been doing lately. I wanted to jump over to the chat really quick. Zach Haval said, never underestimate the power of incremental progress. The Beatles didn't change music history overnight.
For the worse. They didn't wreck Western civilization. Well, practically the damage they did was in a very short span of time. I'm not kidding. I'm absolutely not kidding.
There's an interesting debate, and we don't have time to flush it all out, but maybe we can entertain it for just a moment here, where I heard that America was at a turning point when we had the ability to choose between the Beach Boys and the vision that they painted for the arts versus the Beatles, and we chose the Beatles, and that's what went wrong. Is how the debate goes.
I don't know. I could say a lot about that too.
Well, then we also have Jason from Dear Woke Christian in the chat. He said, there are more than one way to solve this problem. Speak out while the culture is building the golden idol. The government has no one's best interest in mind. And then he also said, chicken is the homesteading gateway drug, which I completely agree with that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's spot on.
And then Zach also said, God created us for relationship. No one can do anything by themselves for too long. We can choose to die alone, but we live among men.
Wisdom. Yeah.
Not only that, if you try to do everything, you're not going to be good at any one thing.
Yeah,
that's true.
That's my problem, man. I always try to wear too many hats, and I end up becoming jack of all trades, but master of none. And sometimes it's so frustrating to not be a master at anything.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Pretty good to be good at everything, though.
Yeah. There's definitely
there
pros
are
and
also
cons.
the
It's a
problem
trade-off.
of people who are master of one thing and useless at everything else. That
I like
is
that
its
saying.
own problem.
Yeah.
Jack of all trades, master of one, master of none, master of one thing, useless at everything else. That's a good comeback to that.
Yeah.
It's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I'm like, okay, well, what is the road to heaven paved with?
Execution.
There you go.
Which could be taken wrongly as well.
Yeah,
Exactly.
very true. Well, let's go ahead and jump into our second story for the night. So this is from the Tennessee Conservative. New Republican-sponsored legislation has been filed that could be used to effectively censor news outlets and businesses across the state of Tennessee. House Bill 0183, sponsored by Representative Sam Whitson, and Senate Bill 0160, sponsored by Senator Richard Briggs, seeks to redefine a political action committee, PAC, as a club, corporation, association, or other group of persons that receives contributions or makes expenditures to support or oppose a measure, or B, a club, corporation, association, or other group of persons that receives contributions or makes expenditures to support or oppose two or more candidates for public office during a calendar year, and the contributions or expenditures in the aggregate exceed $2,000. Consider any news outlet that prints articles that have language that either directly supports / opposes a measure or candidate, or simply publishes articles that have language within that could be interpreted as such. Even though these news outlets and companies do not exist for the purpose of political campaign fundraising or for the sole purpose of supporting / opposing any particular measure or political candidate, this forced conversion into PACs would place all the campaign finance regulations that apply to PACs onto these groups as well. Under the regulatory authority of the Tennessee Registry of Election Finance, when a PAC steps out of line, they have the power to end the PAC to fine the PAC up to $10,000 or to close the organization. So that's some legislation that was very recently being considered here in Tennessee as of this last week. So definitely some scary legislation coming out, and there's a lot of technical terms there. But gentlemen, your reaction?
I think those. I'll just jump in. I think that those people putting forth the bill should answer for what the bill's intentions are. And this is why legal language gets so precise. Like if you've ever read a really well-written contract, the legal language is so precise to avoid just this kind of scenario, because they may not have intended the bill to. I think it says at the end of the article that, their intentions for the bill aren't clear. Maybe they're trying to take out some opposition PAC and they accidentally wrote language that loops in the press. And even if it did pass, it'd be unconstitutional anyway, because of the First Amendment. But this is why, congressmen and senators, they need to be really held accountable. Like, what is the intentions behind this bill? Like, because I think the worry is that they're aiming for censorship through backdoor means, but I that doesn't, maybe, but that didn't see that. What wasn't the impression that I got? Just seemed like poor legislation.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree that very well could be the case. I think what's interesting is the theme that I've been learning more and more about legislators is just that, again, they can't be experts in everything. So that ties in nicely to what we were just talking about. Oftentimes they are someone who's more of a jack of all trades, but is a master of none.
Jackass of all trades.
There we go. But then they
Politicians.
have to legislate on all things. So then that's where it becomes really slippery. I think what's concerning here is the idea that if corporations were turned into PACs, the authority is then granted to the state to shut down those corporations if they basically step out of line in any sort of way with their finance regulations. And that's of course concerning because of a lot of what we talked about in our first story of, you speak out, you say something that's not considered the approved narrative. There's immediate persecution that could come on behalf of that from a career standpoint or your business or a corporation. It just said any group. I think it said group or individual, if I remember right. So, I mean, that's club, corporation, association, or other group of persons. So other group of persons is such a broad reaching term. So that's where that really concerned me when I first read that legislation. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts on that.
Well, who's deciding exactly what does or does not fit their definition here? That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
It doesn't say anything about that either.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding that, like not just who they're potentially censoring, but the words that they're censoring or the content that they're censoring is subject to the discrimination of whoever's making that decision.
Yeah. Yeah. And part of the issue with this is, ultimately you could, it did say anything that could be interpreted as an endorsement or a rebuking of a certain measurement or politician could then fall underneath this category. So, I mean, that could be anything from a company like Wendy's, who are just major trolls on Twitter, trolling someone, they could all of a sudden be considered a PAC and be fined and shut down, to the tune of either thousands of dollars or just immediate closure of their business. And it could be anything from, from someone who maybe is a member of or owns a small business, but personally it has a group that meets in their house that talks about legislation, and maybe, there's no defined terms here. So I think that's a huge slippery slope, and this legislation really just does not provide enough guidance to get exact language. And that's scary to me.
Yeah. I think a micro version of this is what we've seen in the metaverse through Instagram and Facebook. Think of, for the past 2 years, any content that is published that has any semblance of a reference to COVID-19 has that little thing across the bottom saying, for information about COVID, click here because you're obviously being lied to. Like, that's the implication there. And that's a much more docile version where it's saying you're being given misinformation, so you better be corrected. And in this case, the potential, and of course we take everything to extremes as legislators should, but the extreme would be, this smells like something we don't like, so we're going to shut it down and defund it and completely eradicate the resources that are being promoted. And it's then opinion-based journalism that's subject to governing authority in an exact opposition to the First Amendment. So it just kind of goes back to what Will was saying to begin with.
Yeah. And what's hard about that is just at the end of the day, we have to kind of, as citizens and believers, look through this legislation and decide how we're going to respond to it. So, I mean, do you guys have any thoughts on how citizens of Tennessee should respond to this type of legislation?
I mean, senators, congressmen are really responsive, surprisingly responsive to letters and phone calls. Like they just get so little force feedback from their environment that they're mostly being directed either by instinct or their political buddies or whoever pulls their strings. But when they actually hear from their constituents in large enough numbers, they do at that level, they do actually respond. And so it's a good thing that I think was it the Post Millennial or something like that, highlighted this story, because it gives people the chance to really be like, yeah, no, that's not okay. That would be the first thing, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it is our responsibility ultimately to be citizens and actually to be co-rulers, as it were, and actually take our freedoms into our own hands, so to speak, with actually being responsible for knowing what's going on. And I think that's the big thing, is we live in a day where it's so easy to check out, and ultimately I think there are forces that want us to check out all the time. So I mean, it's tempting. Like, I was not a politically aware person prior to the COVID lockdowns. I was completely unaware of the politics of just everything going on around me. And then, the moment lockdowns happened, that's when to be honest, I was one of those people where the first 15 days, I thought it was like legitimately like an actual threat, because, they were very much marketing it like that. And because I wasn't a super politically aware person, I grew up in a home that was fairly conservative, but no one in my family were super in tune to that stuff. And so then when the 15 days came, me and my wife, my wife is just kind of a easygoing person. She was not worried about things in general. And I was sitting there like, wait, you need to not go out more than necessary. Like, this is like, they're saying this is like really deadly. Like, I don't want us to get sick. And we're talking like the lockdowns were just announced.
Yeah.
By the end of the lockdowns,
totally fine.
Yeah. And by the end of the lockdowns, I was already like starting to get suspicious. And then they start extending that 15 days. And honestly, I started just watching. President Trump was doing, those daily press briefings on COVID, and I'm not going to sit here and give a bunch of defense for Trump, but I will say that when you watch something where you hear something said, and then you start to see articles saying like completely warping what you heard, that's what started to make me realize, like, oh, I always knew, because I'm a Christian and I grew up fairly conservative. I always knew that there was a worldly bent to media and Hollywood and things like that, academia even. But I never knew until something forced me to wake up, because I was just living my own life, trying to just pursue my own career, not thinking much about politics. The moment something was shoved in my face and I looked at it longer than a few seconds, because I wanted to be apolitical, and I think most people have that temptation to be apolitical. And you see, wow, every mainstream outlet just lied about what I just heard. They're telling me to not believe my own eyes and ears, and that was nuts to see that. And that was like total shock. And it took a while for me to kind of like shake out of that and realize, like, okay, I guess I now realize that I have been asleep, and I now no longer have that luxury, because I felt sort of like I was almost like a brought into the mafia. Like, now I know too much. I can't go back to sleep. Like, I can't quit the mob. I know too much. They'll come after me. Like, that's almost how it feels like now. It's like I almost feel an obligation to stay awake. So I'm curious if any of you guys have felt any of that.
I mean, I went into COVID. I was already aware for about 7 or 8 years at that point of just how distorted and broken every institution is, on every level. But COVID was when they all kind of pivoted in turn to become predatory on humanity. And so I had this heuristic, and pardon my language for a minute, but if it's on TV, it's bullshit. COVID is on TV, therefore it's bullshit. Right. And like, oh, they showed a man in China like shaking and falling down. Oh, quick, burn the world. Right. But the thing is, like, even during that, and that's basically what happened, right? Like, all this shady footage coming out of China. I remember when they showed this footage of guys in white suits with like these like Ghostbuster style backpacks on, walking down the street, like hosing down the street with like steam or something like that. Like, is that like, congratulations, you hose down the pavement? Like, is that a thing? But I understand people who would. I give a grace period of like 3 months of buying it. Like, I really, if
and that's pretty generous.
It's super. I mean, like, at that point, if after 90 days, if you've been trusting the media your whole life. And if at the end of 90 days, it's like, we're not all dead, maybe they're not telling us the truth. Like at that point, like the severity keeps getting more and more like, are you not seeing this? Are you not seeing this? So like after 15 days, 30 days, that's fine. Cause it's unprecedented as far as people are concerned. Like, let's shut down everything and lock people in their homes. And if after 90 days, 15 days of slow to spread, became what, 4X, and people aren't dead. No, it's more than that. 6X. Right. And people aren't dead. Like, at that point, you're gonna be like, what's actually going on here? And a lot of people went on that journey, but some people, they never ever will. And that's the scary part.
It's astounding to see people who are still regularly masking in social events and getting booster shots on a regular basis as an ongoing thing. It's hard to believe that that's still happening, because we now have medical data and experience under our belt to say, look, it's not deadly. I mean, don't get me wrong. There were casualties. There were lots of people who died of the virus, but a healthy. There's a lot of people who died with the virus.
Yeah, ding 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 ding. I like you.
Yeah, but really, if you're, and this was always my what I say of my wife and I is that we're healthy, we're young, we are fit, we have a decent diet, we eat well. I'm not concerned about other illnesses, and I'm not concerned about COVID-19 either. So I would rather have the illness than take the vaccine, because I know what the illness will do to me more than I know what the vaccine will do to me.
Yep.
And that's
honestly,
that's not a political statement, that's a logical argument based on my individual health. And there are people who would chagrin me because of that stance.
Well, logic is racist now.
Well, yeah.
Didn't you get the memo?
Clearly.
Yeah, really. Logic. 2 + 2 = 5, bro. Like, that's the world we live in.
Yeah, if Jason's still on the live chat, maybe he'll have some insight on that, because I know Jason he absolutely believes that logic is racist. That's for sure. Yeah, Joey, what were you gonna say?
Well, you need to respect my truth, is what I was going to say just now. But no, I was going to say, for me, getting the little paper that said I was infected, I didn't have any symptoms except for when I lost my smell halfway through. But the 3 weeks that my work made me stay quarantined at home was worse for me on my mental health of being separated from any contact with anybody than the actual virus itself.
That's interesting. Say more about that, because like I'm the sort of guy, like I'm really good on my own. Like, someone posted on Twitter, like, this cabin out in the woods, like, like $1 million to stay in the cabin or something like that. It's like, I'll stay in the cabin for 2 years. You know what I mean? Like, but the isolation, I think, was really powerful for a lot of people. The notion of being denied contact. Now, that's not me, but that doesn't mean it's not appropriate. So say more about how the isolation impacted you.
Well, part of it may have been that it interrupted my plan to propose to my now wife.
Oh,
that's big.
I was waiting to talk to my father-in-law, and he drew it out. He wouldn't let me catch him at a moment. He wanted it to be a big deal. So it all
father-in-law?
Happened. I wanted to ask my father-in-law's permission before I asked her to marry me.
Yeah, and he wanted to drag it out and make it a big deal.
He wanted to make it an event. Our talking. Anyway,
he was making him work for it.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I like that. That makes sense. It's like, no, you have to bring me flowers. Like,
not quite.
Did you wash my car yet?
No, just stuck at home. I lived alone. It wasn't so bad the first week. I mean, it was 3 weeks off work. I painted my kitchen cabinets, and that was great. But I don't know. Yeah, I would say maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if I wasn't in that season of life that I was in. If I was married and had the same thing happen, it would have been a lot different for me. But I think that was an eye-opener for me, because I always thought, I'm pretty introverted. I don't have to be around people. And I found that I actually thrive, maybe not out of I'm not a big talker or anything, but I do just prefer having some sort of presence around me.
Got it.
Yeah, but then you got your little gold star, and they said you were infected, and you couldn't
Yeah.
go and patronize things. So you know that's
it was a
Oh,
testing required by work because we had one employee that was sick. I would have kept working if they hadn't made me. But
well, now I think that the big thing that you were saying, Michael, about the people that are still masking up. What's interesting is I've noticed, at least when I walk around, that it's young people. It's mostly young people. And that's really concerning to me. I mean, I definitely see old people, like really old people, I feel like are maybe still doing some of that. But when I just go to like Walmart, it's like college age students that are wearing the masks, no one else. And that's really interesting to me because it really feels like a social experiment that, in a way, kind of did what they wanted it to do. This next generation is the one that's going to grow up with this being the new normal. And the Overton window has completely shifted on what's acceptable for the government to do in a crisis. And in fact, recently Joe Biden just extended his emergency powers. But beyond Biden doing it, good old conservative Greg Abbott of Texas, governor of Texas, just extended his emergency powers. So, you know, Texas, what are you guys doing down there? You guys got to get your stuff together. That's just nuts. We got just like miniature tyrants running around.
Like, politicians aren't in a hurry to give back power when you give it to them. That's not how it works. If power is allocated to you, you hold on to it and you extend it for as long as you can. That's like a global rule. And by the way, real quick about the young people with masking, I don't think it's that they're actually afraid of the virus. I don't think that's it. I think what was it? Was it Jack Posobiec, someone like that, maybe Cernovich, said that masks are the MAGA hats for liberals.
Yep.
That they wear the mask to signal their political allegiance to the state.
Yep.
And also, I think for young people who are insecure about their appearance, they wear the mask because it's like, oh, I can just hide my face and I don't have to be seen. And I think, you know, for an underfathered generation, they lack, you know, courage and boundaries to present themselves. And so I think all these things are wrapped up. I don't think they're actually worried about the virus anymore. I just think they're hiding and signaling allegiance to something. But it's all the same to the government.
They may pretend to be afraid of the virus. I mean, I've got people that I'm close to here who still wear masks and say it's because they haven't gotten the COVID vaccine, or they have gotten the vaccine and they've been boosted regularly, but they haven't had the virus yet, so they don't want to. Which I hear that and I say, don't you think you might have been exposed in the past 2 years living in this world?
Are you sure you haven't had it?
Maybe you're just asymptomatic, and praise God, you can take that stupid mask off.
Wait, what's the point of getting the vaccine and all the boosters if you're not protected from the virus? Like, you should be bulletproof. Don't you believe in your corporate pharmaceutical overlords, them protecting you to modify your DNA?
Exactly.
Hey guys, we have a winter storm coming, so make sure that you wear your coat so that your neighbor doesn't freeze.
It's a confusing thing, and in this case, these are good, biblically sound Christian people who have been misled and it's a weird psychological experiment, and I look at that because they're not like raging liberals or anything. They're
not. I don't think they're biblically sound individuals. Like now, these might be friends of yours, and I don't mean to speak about that. I'll speak about them in the abstract, but I don't think that surrendering your bloodstream so that you can participate in the social contract. I don't think that's biblical. Government says we want access to your bloodstream so you can do these things. Okay, here. You know, I don't think there's anything biblical about that. But I don't think that's their fault for not knowing that.
But it's the loving thing to do. We're supposed to love people.
It's not loving at all. I'll push back on that and say, no, the loving thing to do is to take the vulnerable people and to sequester them and give them everything that they need, while the rest of us, the vast, vast, vast majority of people, go on about our business of civilization. If you are a vulnerable population to this, we will sequester you, and we will make sure that you're provided for and you can mask up and be safe and secure from all of us, and the rest of us are going to go about life. We are not going to shut down civilization to accommodate less than 1% of people. And that's the tyranny that we're under. It's called tyranny of the minority.
Yep.
And we see it everywhere. This notion that there's one person crying in the world, stop everything. We need to stop the world because someone's crying. And that's, and we just accept that that's because it's loving. It's actually not loving at all. It's indulgent. It's using our pity. And there's this book called The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis that I just finished. Brilliant book. And it's a fable about heaven and hell. And he has a whole passage at the very end of the book about how pity can be used to benefit people, but the person who's being benefited can use your pity against you as a weapon. And that's what's going on. It's like, pity me and do what I say. That's not loving at all, bowing the knee to that.
Yeah. In addition to that, I think there was
I get fired up.
Yeah, no, and as you should. I think there was an interesting switch to kind of build off of that occurred, where I think it was probably present, but maybe wasn't as noticeable until COVID happened. But there is a switch where our culture put the elderly before the children. And that's backwards from what we traditionally used to think of. You used to think that the parents and the grandparents sacrifice for the children and the grandchildren. But in reality, this next generation, the amount of financial burden, let alone the mental health, the suicide rate has skyrocketed. There was an article just recently, and I'll have to find it. Maybe I'll just post in the show notes later. But there is an article that said that the U.S. has officially put a number saying that there was about 300,000 excess deaths due to lockdowns that were not non-COVID related. So this is not the people that die with COVID. This is like just from like taking things like the amount that the suicide rate went up and factoring that in, the amount of, drug abuse that went up and factoring that in.
Misdiagnoses from not going to the doctor.
Exactly. So 300,000 deaths, and I'm sure that number is a lot higher because I don't think that there's ever been an accurate count on that. But that in itself is insane. But just this idea that now this younger generation, because of the lockdowns, everything has gone up. And you can blame a little bit of everyone. You can blame Republicans. You can blame Democrats. You can blame specific governors, but specifically the older generation who were already established are fine for the most part. But now there are people that are our age and younger who now they were about ready to buy their first home. I'll just speak for myself. My wife and I were about to buy our first home right before COVID happened. We almost had our down payment ready to go. And then COVID happened. Everything shut down. Inflation shot up because builders stopped. So price, the demand went up immediately. And we were in Phoenix. So Will, about this. We were in the Phoenix area, and Michael, you as well. And that area specifically like doubled when it comes to the prices of a starter home. And that's why we moved. We went to a completely different state to buy our first home because we were not going to be able to become homeowners. And, it's statistically been proven that is one of the biggest wealth drivers. And it's not that, I'm saying we should be focused on becoming wealthy, but I do want to leave an inheritance to my children because, like I said, the older generations should sacrifice for the younger generation. But now we have this whole bass-ackwards idea of the older generation completely made the younger generation sacrifice for them, many of which some of the people that were most adamant about it that I knew personally were in their 80s. And it's like, not to sound mean, but it's like you just sacrificed your grandchildren's futures so that you can live on this green earth another 5 years if you're lucky. And not to sound horrible and dark about it, but that's just putting it bluntly. So I don't know. That was surprising to me is all I'll say.
I can't. That's what me say about that. So I'm reading this book. I read a lot of books. I'm reading this book called Libido Dominandi by Dr. E. Michael Jones. He's a very controversial figure, but this was one of the books that catapulted him to the world stage. I think it came out in 2000. And in that book, he talks about the behaviorist Professor John B. Watson. And Professor John B. Watson, among many others at the time in the early 20th century, discovered that you can control people by manipulating their behavior, and you can begin when they're little babies, essentially. And so following some of his research, there was a whole move by parents, like baby boomers' parents. So the parents of baby boomers' parents. So this is not the greatest generation, but their parents. So we're going back a couple, 3 generations. So the whole move to have mothers withdraw from their children and not be nurturing and loving to them, to be essentially very cold to them, so they would grow up sort of more independent. Like thousands of years, mothers were deeply engaged, connected to their children, passing down values to their kids through that connection. Now, in the early 20th century, with behavioral science, they pushed against that, because if you can prevent the child from getting values from its parents, you can inject new values into the child, right? So that was kind of the thrust. So the parents of baby boomers were very withdrawn, and they were very cold with their kids. So their kids never knew that really tight mother, and it was promoted in all the magazines. I have the book in the other room, and I can actually get the list of magazines. I'm talking like Harper's, all the magazines are talking about this. So essentially, my dad's parents and my mom's parents were raised by cold and distant parents, because that's what they were told to do. So baby boomers' parents were cold and distant. So baby boomers have a certain coldness and distance to the suffering of their own kids now. And it goes back 100 years. That's how deep the social engineering has gone. Because you talk to baby boomers today about, look, inflation's blowing up. There's a war in Ukraine. People are losing their lives. And they're like, so sort it out. I did. And it's infuriating. And that's the riot. That's where the okay boomer meme came from. It's like, how can you be so dead to the suffering of so many millions of people and completely numb to the fact that kids can't own a home? Like, well, I got mine. It's like, I got mine is not what's supposed to apply to your own kids, but it's because they were improperly parented, and then they were manipulated by the Beatles in the 1960s. So whoever posted that, burn your Beatles albums, all of them.
It goes beyond social conditioning, even to physical conditioning. You know, my wife's grandparents have said, we got in the conversation of breastfeeding with my wife's grandparents. And they said very clearly, oh, the doctors told us that breastfeeding was unhealthy, so we gave our kids formula. What? How is it possible that a man-made formula is better for you than the very teat that God has created for that purpose?
There are women that would have killed for breast milk, especially during that formula shortage, but even before it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
This is the behavioral conditioning, because what John Watson said is no one has enough information about how to raise a child, which is preposterous, because how did we get here for thousands of years? Mothers intuitively know how to raise children. I think fathers do too, but now everyone's like, well, you know, the experts say, so I better listen to the experts, and they don't trust their own intuition with raising their own kid. Well, I read in Mother Today magazine that if breastfeeding's bad, so I'm going to pump my kid full of soy. Thanks, doctors.
Enjoy your estrogen.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to do a hard transition in our next story, because it actually is somewhat in line with this, which is the idea of defending the older generation defending the younger generation. So this is let me go ahead and pull this up here. So this is also from the Tennessee Conservative. So, from drag queen story hours to family-friendly drag shows and parades taking place across the United States, the sexualization of children has been quickly spreading throughout our culture. Representative Duggett, a father to 4 children himself, has proposed a bill that would require adult entertainers to secure a valid permit before participating in any compensated form of adult entertainment. These permits would be monitored by and secured through the adult-oriented establishment board in jurisdictions that have one. The summary for HB 0030 also states that the legislation prohibits public, private, and commercial establishments from allowing persons under the age 18 to attend a performance featuring adult cabaret entertainment. While this legislation would provide a sense of relief to many Tennessee parents, some may view the sentiment to be common sense. Regardless, this seemingly basic approach is often necessary where such a massive cultural phenomenon is concerned. So that is a bill that is currently being considered in Tennessee to ban all age drag shows. So your thoughts, gentlemen?
It's a creative approach to the problem. Like classify drag shows as stripper performances and get them at them that way. Like you give the guy points for creativity.
Yeah.
They're saying in jurisdictions that have a board that will govern these things, don't they have to implement those boards in various jurisdictions as well? So what about all of the areas that don't fall under that umbrella?
My guess would be that would go to like a city council or county officials, depending upon, because my guess would be the ones that don't have that board are probably more rural areas.
Yeah.
But that's just a speculation. I have no.
Those
I have
backwater
no
drag shows, you got to watch out.
Big drag festival, big drag show festival in the cornfields.
Yeah. All the kids.
I've been surprised. All across Tennessee, there have been shows popping up, even in some of the smaller rural districts, and it has been rather shocking. So I for one, am just glad to see that some action is being taken, and hopefully that will start to move the needle.
I mean, I don't know.
You could hope it's common sense, but and to the point of what it's saying is like some people say it's unnecessary because it's common sense. Well, common sense is not all that common.
No.
Common sense is less common than ever before, even. But
I just don't think people have the courage to push back. I do not think people have the courage to push back on this. But please go ahead, Joe.
Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering, what was that bit about? It mentioned compensation at the beginning of the article too, because it seemed like that kind of ruled out. I mean, I imagine if a drag queen is performing at a library, they're not getting compensated. So it seems like that's an odd thing to include in this proposition.
Yeah, let me see. It would require adult entertainers to secure a valid permit before participating in any compensated form of adult entertainment. So yeah, you're right. Actually, that is really interesting. In fact, that might be something that should be addressed specifically in a legislative session, making an amendment to that bill.
So if it's pro bono, it's free game. That's
apparently.
I think they'll do it for free, probably.
So, Will, why do you think that people are so afraid and not willing to speak up against this type of thing?
Well, do you want the real answer?
I want the raw answer.
Okay, the raw answer is that if a man and his wife have to both be absolutely totally aligned on this, and she has to be in total moral agreement with him that it is, as the Bible says, an abomination, and they have to be very strong in their faith, potentially even against their pastor who may be bought into it. If that is not the case, even if a man feels strong enough in himself to stand up against this, all the social pressure will land on his wife, and his wife will come in and say, honey, maybe we shouldn't go so hard. It's fine. It's fine. And the simple fact is that women are more agreeable than men. Women are not generally these days submitted to their husbands. They will not take their husband's authority in religious and spiritual matters as they're supposed to. And they're subject to social pressures from I'll say feminists, but feminism is just proto-wokeism. Like feminism was the original woke movement, right? It's the mother of woke. And so women and many of their friends have feminism and wokeness programmed into them. And so the woman is the tip of the spear against a man's heart. And if he decides to push the point and she bows to pressure and withdraws from him, it just pierces his heart and he can't go on. And very few men have emotional support, moral support from other men and pastors around him to fight that battle within the walls of his own home. Now, men have trouble doing it with their own kids too, because kids get it from their friends and from school and from TikTok, but your wife has to be aligned with you. And the simple fact is that's just not the case. Again, we've inherited a really awful situation, and it extends right into for married men into their beds, so to speak.
Dang.
Yeah. You feel that. You feel that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the turnaround for that?
I mean, it's called the Bible. I don't mean to be smart about that, but I mean, like, it really is the Bible. And so that's why I say that, like, being a biblically literate Christian, there's the 1599 Geneva Bible, Patriots Edition, that kind of lays out how, I don't know how many of you guys have heard of the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was printed before the King James Bible. It was a radical. Yeah, exactly. It's very powerful. There's a book called The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate by Matthew Tuella, which also talks about, where civil government fits into church government, the overall governance by Christ over the world. And men need to get real familiar with what biblical scriptural reform teaching teaches about dominion, not just over the political arena, but also over the arena of the church and the home. The church, the state, and the family are the three spheres. The Kuiperian spheres, I think, is maybe what that is. I could be falsely attributing it to Kuiper, but I've heard the term mentioned. And so that's what dominion looks like. In addition to, Michael, you mentioned your body, or Joey, maybe you mentioned that too. You have to have dominion over your body first. But a lot of men aren't really ready to aren't prepared to take dominion yet. And so now we're going to live under someone else's dominion. And those are your two choices.
So how can we help men become more prepared to take that dominion?
renofmen.com/mentorship. So I had to.
Excellent.
That's a good
No,
point.
I mean, like you mentioned Nate Spearing at the start. Nate Spearing is one of many content creators who's talking about this. I love what Doug Wilson and the Moscow Crew are putting out. C.R. Wiley as well. I think there's a real strong cadre of Reformed preachers. Whether you're Baptist or Presbyterian, Jeff Durbin's another one that are really beginning to talk about this issue. And so the first step is to begin consuming content, so you feel comfortable and fluent in the topics and the subjects, and then find a group of men.
Yeah. Camaraderie is definitely good. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah. The scripture that everyone has such a problem with concerning men and women, I mean, not everyone, but one of the scriptures that is often in question would be Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22. Wives, submit to your husbands, and so on, because submit is a dirty word in our culture. But I think what's really important to recognize is verse 21 says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And something that Will is touching on is, before wives can properly submit to their husbands, we have to submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. And what does reverence to Christ mean? In the end of the book of John, or John 14, he says, if you love me, you'll follow my commandments. And how can we presume to have righteous relationships with our spouses if we cannot uphold a righteous relationship with our God? In enacting love for Jesus as followers of Jesus, then we ought to be standing up for his righteousness. So it's kind of a cyclical response to the problem. But it seems to me that through scripture, part of the problem that Will is identifying is that men feel pressured by by their wives who are not willing to submit in a biblical archetype, because it's believed that the biblical archetype is oppressive. But certainly we are both called to submit to Christ. We submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. And in that submission, I mean, I don't need to exegete Ephesians chapter 5 right now, but that scripture asks a lot more of men than it does of women.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Suffice to say that for now. And for women who are not willing to submit to their husbands, I'll concede, if men are not submitting to Christ and honoring the righteousness that God has called them to, then I think that point is moot. But If
It depends. It really depends. It depends. Like if he's being obviously abusive, or committing some sort of an abhorrent, violent, or disrespectful acts, that's one thing. But I mean, like just because your husband is misbehaving in a let's say illegal or immoral way, I guess it depends on the immoral way, but that doesn't mean that you as a woman are no longer under God's commandments. It doesn't change.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the way that I read that scripture is we are submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ. And insofar as I'm doing that, then it is my wife's absolute, unwavering obligation to submit herself to my authority in the righteousness that God has called me to. So when it comes to this problem of the social pressures that our culture has led us into, where Christian wives are afraid of the word submit, and that there's pressures surrounding men standing up for the sake of righteousness. I know in my own relationship with my own wife, because that's the only one I can speak to, she is very good at supporting me when I become indignant against unrighteousness. And that's been one of the greatest blessings in my marriage. But that doesn't make it easy for her, because she's very non-confrontational, and I am quite confrontational, and I'm not agreeable, and she is very agreeable. So, but all that to say, as men and women, out of reverence for Christ, we should love Jesus by doing what he has commanded to us, and in following his commands to uphold the righteousness that he's called us to for the sake of the community. So really, I can't figure out how there are Christians who are willing to be complacent in the face of pure, unrighteous, evil attacks against the culture of our kingdom.
Because they believe they have cover to do it, because their pastor doesn't stand up. If their pastor doesn't stand up, like, why should I?
Yeah. I tend to agree with that, because, I think I know a lot of pastors that are even very biblical in their teaching, what they actually, teach from the pulpit. They're very biblical, but they're not necessarily vocal when it comes to specific things going on in our culture. Like these drag shows, like it's happening all across the state of Tennessee. Why is it happening all across the state of Tennessee when there are, so many professing believers in this state specifically? We're in the heart of the Bible Belt. And I mean, even liberal news stations here talk about, when they're even going through the weather, they talk about like, oh, so on Sunday when you're going to church, make sure that you bundle up because it's going to be a cold one out there. It's like, that doesn't even happen in other states. I grew up in Washington. I lived in Arizona for a while. Like that doesn't even happen in those states. It happens on a fairly liberal, left-leaning news station in Tennessee, just because of there is such a presence of church attendance here. And yet at the same time, these events have been popping up all over the place. So it's just really interesting to see that really, the moment you give the enemy a foothold, he takes it, and he takes it hard.
Yep. People don't want to really root themselves on what the Bible teaches about earth, what it teaches about reality, what it teaches about men and women, what it teaches about sin. They don't want to plant their feet in that, because to do that is deeply uncomfortable. It shatters the illusion of normalcy that we're living under, and it shatters the notion that you can be complacent in any aspect of your life. And COVID was supposed to be a wake-up call, and it was for many people. But a lot of people, they cannot let go of their comfort. They cannot let go of their sin. They're not absolved of their own shame. They're carrying unconfessed aspects of their lives, and they're just owned. And so, they haven't been living up to their own biblical principles. And in the process, they give Christianity a bad name. How many pastors struggle with a porn problem, right? Probably a lot. How many Christian men struggle with it as well? And that's not a judgment. It's just to say that like this kind of, it's reality. And as long as you have, the tentacles of empire creeping into your private life through Instagram or whatever, It's like, how can you expect to have firm foundation within your own heart and spirit to stand up? Right. And men just don't. And that process of purging oneself from sin is painful, but it's got to be done. And that's what'll forge the warriors who can fight this battle.
Yeah. So how do we fight this battle when we are confronted with something that, in my opinion, and I shouldn't even say in my opinion, I would say it's objectively just so blatantly evil. And just to give an example, because I know that people want to make the argument that these drag shows are, it's just a man dressed up like a dude. It's done for humor, or, it's all in good fun. I actually saw this today before, this was not even part of my prepping for this episode. I just happened to see this. This was Libs of TikTok posted this, if you know that. This is a direct quote from a drag queen in front of children. She said, this is a quote, "Cheers to the one that licks us where we pee." This is a drag queen saying this to children. Drag queen in front of children who then hand him cash tips at a family-friendly drag show in Texas. Hey, there we go, Texas. Again, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So how do we fight that when it's so blatantly obvious? I'd love your guys' thoughts.
Well, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I'll just say this. Like, when people say that it's just harmless, it's like, should we let kids start drinking alcohol, taking drugs, and smoking cigarettes then? Like 5-year-olds? Most people will, oh, no. Drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, and sex destroy adult humans regularly. And so it's not harmless. Sex is not even harmless to adults. And so if you're going to propose that children should be participating in quote unquote harmless activities, well, let's just hand them a pack of cigarettes and a beer as well. Because it's no less or more harmful, perhaps even less so actually, than sex and lust is. So that's my argument with that. But please, guys, thanks for indulging me.
Yeah, well, that analogy, just to go off of that really quick, that analogy works well because, the argument is that these men are fully clothed. It's just like an art form. It's like, well, okay, sure, it's not hard drugs, but like to your analogy, Will, it's like, sure, maybe you're not giving the child meth, but you're giving them a cigarette. Like, should you give them sort of this gateway drug? Like I don't know. That's where my mind went immediately with that analogy.
Yeah, it's lust. You're introducing them to lust, right? That's really what you're doing. Is you're desensitizing them to the experience of lust, and lust is a very dangerous sin because lust can never be slaked like gluttony can be. Right? Like gluttony, you can eat enough. Like sex destroys people because you can never quite get enough of it. So desensitizing kids to lust is setting them up for a lifetime of disaster.
Yeah. It's just sad. It's very sad.
Yeah. The topic pisses me off. It's frustrating that's even that is even something that we need to talk about, and it's disturbing to me because there's arguments where, like you said, it's not sexualized. It's an art form. It's been used for thousands of years in art. Men have always dressed like women. Like, no, but these men are sexualizing children. And when it becomes sexual, I don't want a woman dressing that way and speaking to my child that way either. Even if she's a woman dressed like a promiscuous woman. But to have a male dressed like a promiscuous woman certainly doesn't sweeten the pot.
I don't want a man dressed like a man talking to my kids that way.
No, exactly.
And what would they say if it was a man dressed like I don't know.
Yeah, it's not an art form.
I'm tired of people being soft and not calling sin because it makes people feel good and we need to love them, but loving people is not letting them live in their sin and saying that it's fine.
It's like we've said on this podcast before. Jesus didn't go into the place of sinful, promiscuous people and say, I accept you just the way you are. He said, repent. Yes. Go and sin no more.
Then he called them whitewash tombs, and he created a whip and drove them from the temple.
It's a real tragedy that our church does not preach repentance anymore. The North American church preaches acceptance and inclusivity.
Yes.
And that's not the message of Christ.
No.
Certainly there's open arms to all within repentance. But repentance demands something of you that most people are not willing to give. And that's humility, that is changing and altering the belief system and the actions thereof. The message of the cross is so much more than acceptance and love. We are loving to one another in the way that we call them to repentance, because how loving is it to know the scriptures and to know the gospel and willfully allow people to engage in sin that will damn them to hell? Is that loving? Sorry, this is my turn to get all bristled and frustrated, but for God's sake, literally for God's sake, could we just somehow learn to show people love in a way that can save them? Because we're doing a poor job of it, and people will be damned.
Yeah.
And that's a real unpleasant truth that Christians like to ignore.
Mm.
They'll be held accountable for it. That's the part that they don't actually get.
Yeah.
Is that they'll be held accountable for every time that they felt called to preach the word and didn't, or that they were silent in the face of this. It says real clear here in the book, disciple the nations. Where were you on that? Oh, well, I didn't want to ruffle any feathers. It's like, what did Christ do? He ruffled feathers, until he got crucified for it.
And promised us that we would have hardship as well when we followed him.
That's right. Paul, Peter, all, James, Stephen, you name it. It's like, but Christians don't want to follow that example. They don't.
Yeah.
Not ready to.
Well, to give a quote that's often attributed to Bonhoeffer behind me here, but we don't actually know 100% if it was Bonhoeffer, but it's attributed to him. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Yeah.
It seems to be a reoccurring theme with our 3 topics tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just to go all the way back to the very beginning, by the way, just real quick, that what that one guy did, just not to wear the jersey and to say nothing else other than that's considered noteworthy. Like, that's the peak of pushback. It's like, nope, I'm just not going to wear the jersey, but I'm not going to talk about it.
How low is the bar?
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. Well, that said, I want to end on a little bit of a positive note, because the second story that we tackled, the one about the free speech, whether that was done maliciously or just poor legislation, I wanted to kind of let the audience know that really there was only about 1 or 2 local news outlets here that covered it, but they did post the information to call the different senators and representatives that were working on that legislation, and the senator that was sponsoring the bill has promised to pull it from consideration. So I don't know if he's done that yet, so that's something that people in Tennessee should watch out for. But that is some good news, because first of all, that does show that when you make a stink of things, you can affect some positive change. So then the second point to that, for this bill about banning underage drag shows, there is actually a hearing being done tomorrow that is open to the public that a lot of people are being encouraged to go and see in the Capitol in Nashville. So feel free to check that out. Robbie Starbuck is the guy that's been organizing a lot of that. You can always follow him on his Twitter or social media. But beyond that, I have gone ahead in the show notes and I have included the contact for the legislators that are working on it. So go ahead and contact them, send them an email, give them a call, let them know that you support the bill and that you want them to put a stop to all age drag shows in the state of Tennessee, because honestly, we can move the needle. We can create laws that reflect righteousness, not that we can make people righteous through legislation, but we can create legislation that can reflect some form of righteousness if if the Christian culture of Tennessee that is supposedly so present here enough to where a liberal news outlet mentions going to church on Sundays, then I think we can use that influence to affect positive change in legislation. So that is my charge that I will leave the audience with, as well as an encouragement. So yeah, but we'll go ahead and go to you guys for closing thoughts. So Will, we'll start with you. Any closing thoughts, and where can people find you?
No, I've really enjoyed this. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for indulging me in some of my fired up, passionate rants, and I'm very grateful that conversations like this are happening between men, digitally or otherwise. So it's very important. So thank you, gentlemen, for having me on. And you can find more. Listeners can find out more about me by going to linktree/renofmen, and there you can find my podcast, my own YouTube channel, Instagram and Twitter, and a link to my men's mentorship, which is renofmen.com/mentorship.
Awesome. Joey, where can people find you, keep up with you, and any closing thoughts?
You can find me at the ice rink tonight at 9:15 and at the boot shop tomorrow morning.
Excellent. Michael?
You can find me desperately reading Tolkien while I have one more week before my next semester starts of classes. So I'm halfway through the Two Towers now, and we'll see how far I get.
Good man. We may have to do a special episode just all on Tolkien, because this is your first time reading through them, if I remember right. So we'll definitely have to flush
First
that
time
out.
since 5th grade. Give me
So
a
basically,
little credit.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening on live stream, or whether you're listening to the playback of this on Spotify, Google, Rumble, wherever you might be. We have been Forge and Anvil. We appreciate you listening to us, and feel free to join us Monday nights. We are going to be doing this live stream. I believe it went really well tonight, so we'll try to make this a regular thing. So feel free to join us Monday night lives, and you can jump in the chat, and we will read your chats on air. So feel free to join in on the conversation. But thank you so much for listening.